Thank you very much. It's, of course, a great pleasure to be on my 6th visit to Singapore. I was asked at the airport yesterday what I liked most about Singapore. I said the food, and secondly, what I liked least about Singapore, I'd say the humidity. But fortunately, it's not very humid today, and the food has been excellent, so all is going well. I've taken the title of this presentation, and indeed the theme of the presentation, from the title of the session. I've worked for many, many years on the issue of musical shape in various ways, and I've been pleased as part of our centre to watch the development of a project which I'm going to describe to you. Our centre, CMPCP, the Research Centre for Musical Performance as Creative Practice, which is based in Cambridge with partnerships at a number of universities shown at the bottom of the screen, has had 5 constituent projects, the first of which at the top, Shaping Music in Performance, will serve as the focal point for the first half or so of the presentation, after which, on the basis of that theory, I'm going to present 1 or 2 case studies, depending on the amount of time that we have available. Shaping Music in Performance was a 3-year project in the 5-year centre led by Daniel Leach-Wilkinson, principal investigator, working with Helen Pryor, Dan Tidor, and Mats Kustner. It focused on 3 key research questions. First of all, how do performing musicians use the idea of shape or shaping music? These are key terms in the discourse of musicians in Anglophone communities, at least. Secondly, which aspects of music generate a sense of shape? And thirdly, what mechanisms underlie the music-shape association? What we will try to do in the first part of this talk is to address these questions and use the answers that we come up with as a way of informing the rest of this session, either directly or indirectly. The project in question was a mixed methods project involving, first of all, the accumulation of documentary evidence, and you'll see in the middle here that shape has a wide range of meanings, to put it mildly, across different communities such as composers, musicologists, critics, and performers. It's a normal part of musicians' vocabularies related to human movement or gesture, related to form or structure, and related to musical expression. Having acquired this documentary evidence, the researchers set about conducting an online questionnaire study, and if you follow through this map, you'll see that thinking about shape in relation to music, starting at the left, is appropriate for a wide range of music linked to a range of musical components such as phrasing, melody, the whole piece, dynamics. It feels natural or instinctive. It's common, frequent, but memorable, used in different situations such as practice, teaching, rehearsals, and discussion, varying according to musical genres, cultural background, and capabilities of the musical instrument. In this questionnaire study, a number of correlates or shape equivalents came up, different aspects of music, as you can see here on the screen, and there were further internal correlations which emerged, these co-occurrences between form, structure, gesture, and pattern, dynamics, melody, and rhythm, phrasing and melody, as you can see, direction, color, and flow, emotion and color, contour, tension, and release, contour, line, and release, and intensity, movement, and meaning. These various co-occurrences will again inform much of what follows. They also conducted a number of interview studies with violinists and harpsichordists. 5 professional violinists were used in a semi-structured interview with practical playing tasks, as you can read. The analysis was conducted on the basis of IPA, interpretative phenomenological analysis, with 3 key findings. First, musical shaping involves change in multiple expressive parameters. It's sometimes closely linked with personal and musical identity, and sometimes closely linked with gesture and movement. By way of example, I brought one of the quotes that they amassed. A violinist called Elsie, interviewed by Helen Pryor, stated that every note should have some kind of shape, and every phrase needs to have a shape, and it all depends on whether the note is important or not, whether the harmony is important or not. Well, trying to unpack a statement like that is actually really quite tricky. What does it mean to say that every note should have some kind of shape? What kind of treatment might a musician bring to that particular note to give it shape? And once that treatment had taken place, what would the shape be like? Would we recognize it? How would it be manifested? And so forth. Conducting this interpretative phenomenological analysis involved, first of all, familiarization and summarizing of the discourse, using a code to interpret identifying themes, clustering those themes, and then subjecting the findings to peer review for the sake of rigor. What emerged was this very interesting diagram that my colleagues produced, and you can see across the screen a number of categories: musical level, the trigger that prompted the shape association, the heuristic that allowed this to be modeled, certain technical modifications that resulted, and the change in sound that ensued from those technical modifications. So you can see, starting at the bottom, working up from the level of the note to the level of the entire concert, where the view of the score and musical structure might be a trigger, as opposed at the very bottom to articulation or phrase markings or dynamic markings and so forth, working up the ladder. The heuristics that somehow allow for this understanding of shape to take place include an understanding of the audience, of breathing, a sense of the composer, the musical direction, and so forth, with, as I said, various specific technical modifications leading to changes in sound, decisions, if you like, about instrumentation, program, tempo, ornamentation, timbre, timing, dynamics, vibrato, and articulation, which is to say just about everything at the disposal of the individual musician or indeed groups of musicians. They went further than that and related the diagram I've just shown you to the germs theory of musical expression devised by Patrick Uslin, which has 5 categories: generative rules, emotional expression, random variations, motion principles, and stylistic unexpectedness, defined in the ways shown on the screen. And they looked very carefully and closely at the diagram I've just shown you and attributed these particular categories of expression to specific elements of the diagram, which is to say they are developing a model for musical shape, which I think is really unprecedented and, in my view, very exciting. Here you can see the distributions in question: generative rules shown with the abbreviation G, emotional expression with E, and so forth. This would need a great deal more time than I'm able to give it for us fully to understand the implications of this potential model, but what we're getting at here is, at least as far as I am aware, a new understanding of what shape might mean in the case of the individual musician's practice, the music that he or she produces, and the way in which we apprehend it in very fundamental ways that hitherto have not necessarily been understood and have been lumped together with this term shape, but now will be understood with greater specificity. One further stage occurred in this mixed method approach, an experimental one, which was conducted by our PhD student, Mats Kustner, who's shown here. Yesterday there was a discussion of the Connect device, and indeed Mats is using this remote control Wii device to track his movements when he's listening to music. Various sound samples were played, and participants were invited to track their movement accordingly, and their movements were in turn monitored. And we see, for instance, in this particular example, a gestural response along the y-axis to the stimulus rising and falling. I'm not sure whether this will play or not, but let's see if it does. We may be lucky. That was synthesized, in case you were wondering. Musically trained listeners almost universally went up and down, which is, I suspect, what most of you would have done, just following it up and down. Musically untrained listeners were, as one might have expected, rather less predictable in this, and there was no obvious correlation between moments of pause and so forth. For instance, if a pitch was sustained, the musician would tend to sustain the gesture accordingly, whereas non-musicians might stop because the pitch wasn't going anywhere, which was really quite interesting. But what this shows, among other things, is that shape, along the lines of what I've just described, has a very important embodiment aspect, a bodily aspect, a physical aspect. And again, through a sort of heuristic device, we start with some sort of imagination, perhaps in the composer's mind, a a legacy of that in the form of the score, which is picked up by the musician or musicians in question, who convey the ideas, whatever they might be, using particular physical properties on their instruments or, where relevant, in the voice, which are then observed or at least heard in the case of either live or recorded performance respectively, producing different sound samples which are picked up by the ear, and then the person in question hears these things and understands the gestures that they come from, all being understood in terms of the underlying shapes, which may or may not have anything to do with the original prompt, but in fact would still be sensed as some sort of gestural property, whether literally or indirectly. So the themes that emerge from this study are threefold. First, the shape in the case of musicians' discourse and understanding is a counterpart to musical structure. Secondly, it is can be used as a tool for expressive performance. And finally, it can be used as a tool for realizing musical structure. We might have been able to predict some of these emergent themes right from the start, but as I've said a minute ago, this study has given much more body and substance to the inquiry. So how might musical shape be modeled in analysis and performance? And this is where I step in, because I've been struggling with this issue for many, many years, dating back to my undergraduate work at Princeton under Edward Cohn, who was something of a pioneer in this area, not least his important book, Musical Form and Musical Performance, published in 1968, which is still a very important book, a classic, if you like, in this field. Cohn himself wrote a self-critique in 1985 of his book from 1968, and in the self-critique comes the following quotation, which I think is very relevant to our quest, how we might model musical shape in analysis and performance. He writes, Edward Cohn's discussion is based on the premise that musical form is essentially rhythmic. It is not, as conventional analysis would have it, thematic, nor, pace Schenker, harmonic. Both of these aspects are important, but rhythm is basic. Consequently, Cohn says about himself and about his ideas, an adequate performance of a composition, an intelligently musical performance, is one that projects its overall rhythmic structure. Now, this is fine, provided we understand rhythm in the broadest sense, not in the sense of dotted minims or crotchets or similar. In other words, we understand rhythm as, in Wallace Berry's words, everything. You could look at this the other way around. Every musical aspect could be understood as part of some higher level, larger scale rhythm, or the way he's put it, rhythm is everything. And in my own work, without necessarily trying to exemplify this quote of Wallace Berry, I've been depicting diagrammatically, and in other ways too, different types of musical rhythm which potentially serve as the basis for the shape of a performance, or certain shapes, musical shapes within a performance. For instance, here is a profile of temporal shape in a Chopin nocturne. This is a score-based exercise in that what I have done is to track the main tempos based on Chopin's own metronome markings across the three broad sections of the piece, with slight inflections being introduced non-rigorously by me, just approximately, to show inflection in an otherwise more or less steady tempo. So we have a sense of tempo plateaus here, with the middle section at a much faster clip than the outer sections. Perhaps more interesting to the conception of this nocturne is the dynamic shape that results. This again is a score-based exercise derived from Chopin's own dynamic markings, shown on the left, on the y-axis, and you can see as the piece unfolds temporally across the right, and the way in which tempo changes. So dynamics change. So the first section, very, very flat on the left, and then three successive climbings and fallings, which, if you like, capture graphically the potential energy of this passage in terms of the dynamic material, followed by a peak, another falling off there, and then a return to a flattish final section. You could imagine this diagram in two ways. One, synchronically, outside the context of time, rather like a mountain range seen in the distance, or as a landscape that you are traversing in a diachronic manner. And in fact, these different profiles that I'll show you very quickly do need to be understood both synchronically and diachronically. In a sense, they represent potentially the music's physiognomy as well as its breathing. And I think that that kind of combination is essential to this series of depictions in what will follow. Here is a graph of dynamic markings or implicit dynamic markings in Brahms' Handel variations, and you can start to get a sense of the implicit rhythms here. If you look at this as it flows by, say that rapid oscillation there, variations 7 through 11 or so, followed by the broad sweep, and then a sustained piano dynamic, which paves the way for major change right at the end, another oscillation, a zigzag effect, bouncing off at a high level into the fugue. And then a textural diagram, a Rachmaninoff prelude. This is the number of voices active at any one part, any one time. And then a different type of profile, graph that I showed in a recent paper, 3 different levels, downbeats, accents, if you like, agogic accents, tempo plateaus in the middle, and then a kind of outward gesture from within in this particular performance of Rubinstein. This is not, as you would see from the title and my comment, a score-based exercise. This is based on an actual performance. So where does this leave us in terms of a case study? I'll almost certainly have time only for one, and I'll show you in this case study, which I've called Shaping Performance, in honor of our session title. I'll show you a little mazurka written by Chopin, supposedly when he was only 14 years old. There's an inscription here at the bottom which says, composed by Chopin in 1824. Chopin would have been 14 years old. It's signed Kohlberg, one of the 2 Kohlberg brothers whom Chopin was associated with. This was a presentation manuscript sent through the post, folded into 4, sent through the post for one of these Kohlbergs. I don't think it's from that early, nor do most Chopin experts. We think it's from rather later, and I'll explain why in a second. Let's quickly go through the form of this piece. What we're going to do is to look at a number of formal properties, compare different versions of the piece, and derive a sense of Chopin's evolving conception with respect to shape, and assess finally the potential that this might have for an actual performance. We have, first of all, an A section, which is repeated, 4 bars, followed by 4 bars, and then a B section, which is 8 bars long, dal segno, back to the beginning. That beginning section may or may not repeat. It almost certainly does repeat. It seems too short otherwise. And then we have a trio section, which is marked uncharacteristically by Chopin as a trio, and it's also marked uncharacteristically by Chopin celeste, and that's repeated. And then a D section, poco più lento, followed by another dal segno, and we go back to the beginning. What is particularly interesting here is this D section, which is in A major, a kind of Neapolitan area. That's really rather unusual. In fact, for a piece written in 1824, what we might have expected is not this, but that. That's quite clever. I'd like to just go back, yes. So we don't get this in 1824 so much as that, if we just airbrush out that D section. That would be a perfectly typical mazurka structure for Chopin when he was 14 years old. A symmetrical structure, tonic, subdominant, back to the tonic. But with this intermediate section, there's a rather different musical flow. So, if you like, an implication for musical shape. Here's the hypothetical version from 1824 that I've showed you somewhat playfully just now. That would have been absolutely normal, but this, as I say, is what we actually get. And the D section is the intriguing part. Chopin struggled with this D section, or at least experimented with it in different ways. In this early version, after the celeste at the beginning of the trio, we have poco più lento, pianissimo, and retard leading to the recapitulated A section. In a later manuscript, this is what the mazurka turns into. This is now from 1831, shortly before the piece was published in 1833. Now, this is the same extent of music as we have just seen, but what actually occurs in this piece is something different in this manuscript. We get a coda section, which Chopin eventually abandoned, this coda down here. Chopin eventually abandoned. It was never published. It's sometimes fun to throw it in. People wouldn't expect it. But it was a way of trying to make the piece end more definitively. When you have a symmetrical form with an exact recapitulation of your opening section, it doesn't have a sense of teleology going to a logical ending. So Chopin tried to round off the piece with a coda to give it more finality. Rather different effect. There's the coda section blown up, and we go back the same sections as before, but now with coda. So here's our formal diagram, and you see what I mean about the struggles that Chopin engaged in here. Meno vivo became meno presto, became meno mosso, and then was just left simply as meno. Rallentando replacing smorzando, and then a tempo. And then finally the French first edition, published in 1833, and this is a completely different animal from the other two versions that we've seen. First of all, Chopin varies in typical fashion the repeated statement, so we have not an exact repeat, but a varied repeat, A1, A2. The B section comes in, and then further variation, A1 prime, A2 prime, and then C1, C2, more variation occurring here. Section D, our unusual section following now molto rallentando, as opposed to the poco più lento from that earliest version, pianissimo sottovoce with smorzando, and then a tempo, more variation, and then this final A3 section. I probably have just enough time to hack through these versions. So let's go back quickly to, this. I shouldn't show you the score because you can track all the mistakes. I'm sure there will be plenty. The intermediate version. This starts to get a little bit harder. Now we have an anacrusis, if nothing else. And then finally, this version. Now, what we get in this case is a much richer body of expression markings, forte piano, scherzando piano, forte piano, and so forth, with an embarras almost of expression markings in the middle, dotissimo, staccato, and so forth. What's interesting to see here is the kind of inner shaping implicit in these dynamic markings, a kind of retraction motive, which is expressed in these successive sections. This is all drawn proportionally, by the way, in terms of the number of bars. So a kind of statement, retraction, statement, retraction, statement, retraction, and so forth, right across the piece, now at a lower level in this extended trio section, until we get to the recapitulation. The same sort of thing happens, and then what Chopin does here is to end not by adding a coda in a more definitive fashion, but by introducing this rest, and then keeping the dynamic forte to round off the piece more. So there we go. Thank you. What we eventually conclude is a number of things. First of all, at least in the case of Chopin, it is not enough to look at one single version of a piece if one wants to get a broader understanding of what the piece once was in the composer's mind, what it might have become, and what we might do with it. In fact, the basis of understanding that final version that I've just played really has to be developed intertextually and indeed interstitially in terms of the gaps between different versions, what they tell us about the way in which the music might be modeled in sound and across time. I think that the discovery of struggle on the part of the composer with this very critical transitional section, the D section, is important, and I think also his experimentation with ending the piece is very important. The coda on the one hand, which you can see in the middle, and that reversal of the standard, well-established dynamic pattern in the final version. So what we're getting at here then in terms of shape, and this probably is where mathematics might just come into it, is that shaping music, first of all, is an elusive issue. It's something that really we haven't understood in an articulate manner until fairly recently, and this one project that I've described to you, thanks to my various colleagues, allows us to move ahead in that direction. But what we're talking about here is something that is elusive in terms of understanding, but critical to the practice and praxis of performers, the specific details of scores giving rise to an understanding of how music can be modeled over time. And I'm here using this kind of physical shaping to express that notion. In short, shape is something that comes from within the body, that has an understanding in terms of gesture and so forth, and which lies right at the very basis of conception of what music is, what music does, what musical performance attempts to do, and what we might take from performances as listeners. So an elusive but nevertheless critical property of music, which invites the work of mathematicians perhaps so that it can be more fully modeled, but which needs to be understood in very specifically musical terms, and I think ideally with the participation of musicians if we're going to get further than we have done thus far. Thank you very much.